Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the panel. My name is Maiken Umbach from the University of Nottingham, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this panel on mobility and migration in German Jewish photography during the Nazi era. The panel presents findings from a research project at Hebrew University, which is directed by Professor Ofer Ashkenazi on vernacular Jewish photography in Nazi Germany. And the team have amassed between them a database of over 10,000 individual photos and photo albums from archives across 4 continents. And they're now preparing a monograph, a co-authored monograph that will come out of the project. And in this panel, the 3 speakers who are part of the project focus specifically on one subset of these photos that cast new light on the relationship between mobility and migration, emigration from Nazi Germany in this period. And they will also ask how such methodologies can inform the study of Jewish mobilities more generally. I'm going to briefly introduce all 3 speakers at the beginning, and then we'll hear the 3 presentations in turn. Then I will offer a few very brief comments and questions, and then I'll open the floor for more general questions. So first, we're going to hear from Rebekka Grossmann, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Hebrew University. Her research focuses on the intersection of Jewish politics, migratory mobility, and global visual culture. Aspects of her research has been published in Jewish Social Studies and the Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook. And the topic of her presentation today is a camera and a map, independent travel and mobility in German Jewish vernacular photography. Then we will move on to Shira Miron, who is a PhD candidate in Germanic languages and literatures at Yale University at the moment in a project on the intersections between literature, art, and music around polyphony in German thought and prose. Since 2016, Shira has also been part of Ofer's project and wrote for it the article Presence as Absence, the Homely and the Unhomely in Jewish Photography under Nazism, which is forthcoming in the New German Critique. And she today will speak to us about the actual history of the last image, documentation, narration, and remembrance in German Jewish photography of departure. Last but not least, we will hear from Sarah Wobick-Segev, who's a postdoctoral research associate at Hamburg University. She's the author of Homes Away from Home, Jewish Belonging in 20th Century Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, which appeared in 2018, co-editor of The Economy in Jewish History, and Spiritual Homelands, the Cultural Experience of Exile, Place, and Displacement Amongst Jews and Others. Today, Sarah will speak about escape and escapism, how vacation photography informed visions of emigration. So first, over to you, Rebekka.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also to Sarah for bringing us all here together. And it's really a lot of fun to, for the first time, share our different ideas and thoughts and results of this project in something like in a conference, in a panel together. I'm at the same time trying to share my screen, which should work now in a bit. Okay. Now you should see the screen, and I will start without further ado. And I will start with a photograph that many of you, or at least some, might know. It's a collage by Abraham Pesarek, a Jewish photographer who documented Jewish life in Nazi Germany and actually survived the war in Berlin. And this photo collage is on the theme of Jewish migration, made in the midst of a decade of the stress and turbulences of racial exclusion. The image expresses the forced longing for a better life in a better world on the other side of the Atlantic, away from the clouds that darken the present realities. The title of the image, Wohin, echoes the visual signifiers of uncertainty. Maps and terrestrial globes, like the one we see in this photograph here, are ubiquitous as visual symbols of instability in the Jewish photography of 1930s Germany. They speak of plans for migration and attest to the readiness to leave. They blur what becomes all too obvious, that the departure is anything but voluntary and that the ownership of fancy maps and atlases is in fact a statement of these people's rootedness in a culture that cherished Bildung, education, above all else. Like the German ideal of building, that's of course more than education only. This paper is about a different kind of maps of Germany and Europe, and their use illustrates the opposite, their owner's aptness for mobility, and their being rooted in a state of transition. I'm speaking of the maps of German Jewish youngsters, which guided their journeys across Europe between 1930 and 1939. In my paper, I want to follow them on some of their trips, asking what travel and mobility meant for them in times of crisis and how they perceived themselves as travelers in a hostile environment. The medium through which I have chosen, and we all have chosen, to approach the different sources is photography, including albums that the teenagers assembled themselves. They offer insights into the nature of their choices made in a time of transition between Germany and migration to some unknown place, but also between childhood and adulthood. Travel, I claim, offered a space in which feelings of freedom and constraint could be negotiated, preparing youngsters for a near future of often radical independence. Instead of living in a state of waiting, I claim, these youngsters, through their travels, were very much rooted in the present. Let's start our journey by following the teenager Rudi Bartha on his way to Berlin, from Berlin to Zurich. This is a photo collage taken from an album made by Bartha, who at the time was a group leader of the Zionist Habonim youth movement. The album documents different stations of his life during the 1930s, and it actually presents them as a series of travel and mobility. This photo collage shows the two protagonists of the trip, Rudi and his girlfriend Esther. They are arranged here across the page in the order of travel. Esther is in the upper left corner, and she can be seen and is also described as actively waiting for cars. In a later step, she seems to be then even more active by waving. The letters of the word hello are sort of stylized, they become bigger to illustrate the noise and to illustrate this call. Finally, the photograph in the lower right corner supposedly documents success. Rudi is sitting in the car that has been found and the journey can begin. He actually found something that looks even like a convertible car and is apparently riding in the direction of Frankfurt. Arrangements reminiscing avant-garde photo montage style here serve to really emphasize the speed and the noise and also the excitement about this kind of travel. And the map, of course, then shows the whole success of this journey. The different visual elements in their arrangement reflect the contingency of the illustrated activity on the one hand, but also the perseverance of these youngsters and the ultimate coherence of the plan on the other. So this trip to Zurich is before, on a previous page, actually also introduced by an appraisal of Tramp, I want to say, not Trump, Tramp, and the freedom of a vagabond's life. Images of a bright sunny road and timeless cornfields that are just being harvested are embedded in words like, you are drawn out after a year of work anywhere, irgendwohin, only seeing new things, experience, not knowing at noon where you will be in the evening. This is Tramp. So this is really this radical rootedness in the now of being on the road and not really knowing what comes, but also feeling very comfortable in this now. In a period in which much of the country is closing its doors on them, these youngsters come of age by moving about Germany independently. In transferring the city stroll out into the countryside and embracing the unpredictability of tramp life, they create a world of their own, and claim the country's geography back. What made these youngsters roam about so freely, and how did they perceive themselves and their environment? And what do we learn through these photographs about Jewish teenage life in Germany? I want to claim that these journeys differed from other modes and experiences of Jewish travel in Nazi Germany explored by scholars like Jakob Borod and, of course, also Maiken Umbach, who is here with us today, and Sarah Segev, also Ofer Ashkenazi, who is with us in this collaborated project, and Guy Miron. Travel to Jewish youngsters meant different things than it did to families or elderly people. We think here, for example, of Viktor Klemperer, who is talking about his trips with his car. And these travels were part of strategies that were to underscore these people's rootedness in German culture, or sometimes also in order to escape the realities of Nazi German life. I want to show that first, the travels of Jewish youngsters were structured differently. Second, their purpose differed from that of other kinds of Jewish travel. And third, these trips reveal a different relationship with the environment that was seen and perceived by the travelers. Ultimately, this kind of travel offered the very space for these youngsters to grow. On the road, it seems, was where they felt most at home. The kind of travel described here was inspired and shaped by the activities Jewish organizations and institutions had arranged for their youngsters throughout the early 1930s. The path for Jewish youth into any of these movements in the early 1930s were usually very short. Schools and communities advertised them as frameworks to the children of Jewish families, and the movements themselves very often successfully recruited new members, for example, with attractive trips that they could offer their members. These trips were particularly attractive considering that the vacations that well-to-do Jewish families could afford were in fact open only to small stratas of the population. The camps organized by Zionist or non-Zionist Jewish youth movements like the Habonim were open to everyone, on the other hand. This made the experience of travel a far more inclusive and widespread one than the exclusive trips to spas or Baltic Sea resorts of Jewish families. The trips of the movements not only introduced the youngsters to the experience of being away from home, they also opened up a wide geography to them, spanning across Germany and indeed across Europe. The Berlin-based youngster Sally Salomon, a member of the youth movement of the Kameraden, for example, traveled often and far. While the shorter camps at springtime, usually around Pentecost and respectively called Pfingstlager, would go to closer destinations around Berlin, the summer trips went to the Baltic Sea, or for the older ones, even to Sweden or to Prague. No less than 11 destinations are listed in his album covering the years 1930 to 1934, and some of these destinations actually served as locations for more than one trip. National meetings convening different branches of the movement were organized in centrally located regions like the Taunus, near Frankfurt, sometimes followed by trips to additional regions nearby where other branches showed the Berliners their surroundings. So this is all from this one album, the photos that you have seen, the pages. And so here we see that the Kreislager in the Taunus region actually was also connected with a large trip to the Cologne region when the Coloners joined them in like sort of traveling other regions. Notably, and here the source of the photo album becomes important as a text to be analyzed in its own right, we know of these places only through their meticulously being listed underneath these photographs. We don't see much of them in the actual images. The images of Würzburg or Ulm here reveal some bits and pieces of possible sites, but overall they merely provide a stage for what seems to be at the center of attention, namely the communal aspect of travel, the group, the friends, and their jokes. So we see, for example, that they climb up the Ulmer Münster, which has a very large Münster tower, but instead of, for example, taking photographs of the view that they get from up there, they actually only are very self-referentially taking photographs of themselves, which to them seems much more worth the photo paper. Other than their parents, whose acculturation had taken place in reference to German bourgeois cultures of sightseeing or entertainment, these teenagers did not need to show their attachment to these spaces, and indeed disavowed them in opposition to older generations. In 1934, an important aspect of group travel changed. Group travel of the kind that had been possible before was now prohibited to Jewish youngsters. Camps had to take place on private grounds and only if their size remained limited. The necessary infrastructure for shared trips, however, had long been paved. Youngsters continued to travel in smaller arrangements and found creative ways to get around. This is where they perfectionized the art of hitchhiking, for example, or they reused train tickets to then meet up again in the designated location. In fact, we know that this kind of independent travel was actively encouraged by Jewish authorities. After the summer holidays of 1934, for example, one Jewish youth home in Frankfurt had called for the youngsters to send in their best photographs of the trips they had undertaken over the summer and to show them in an exhibition. The results were praised for the wit and the creativity of these youngsters' travel, for example, for the ways they caught rides in cars or even on coal barges on the Rhine. Photographs were taken in all corners of Germany and adjacent countries, a sign, and here I'm quoting, that our youngsters know how to find the most beautiful spots on their own. For the winter, a new exhibition would be planned. Only the most beautiful photographs, so the call went in the Frankfurter Israelitisches Gemeindeblatt, would be shown. The best photographers would be offered prizes in the form of new photo films to encourage yet more travel. We don't know whether Friedel Wolmerstedt took part in these competitions, but we do have her album in which she recorded her trips around her native Frankfurt. From the photographs, we see that she too focuses on her friends, but, and this is something that has changed now, the groups have become smaller, leaving room also for capturing the countryside and sites around them. Still, the way she sees the different sites is different from the families, ticking off boxes and important landmarks. Rarely Friedel or her friends are seen with the sites. Instead, the sites appear as proof to the youngsters' independent outings in and around the area, and also their knowledge of it. So we have here photographs that show either them traveling or some sort of site like in Nauheim or in Wiesbaden, or Aschaffenburg. So we really know that they get around a lot, but they themselves take their photographs on in other places, not in the front of this site, for example. I want to suggest that the combination of being on the road and experiencing the surroundings also offered a way to be part of the realities without standing out. In merely documenting from a distance, Wolmerstedt and her friends rendered their presence ephemeral, being back on the road before being perceived by anyone. The camera as a mediator allows the role of an inside outsider, taking part by seeing and documenting while remaining in a distance, not having to deal with restrictions or prohibitions of the kind that were broadcasted via signs and rules. The same phenomenon can be seen in pictures of Friedel's hometown, Frankfurt, where she takes photographs not like a tourist, but like someone who knows the city, seeking to grasp its diversity, but away from the city's crowds, observing, but unseen. It is this distance which led youngsters like Wolmerstedt maintain the impression of being part of the society around her, negotiating her position in it through the camera. I am arguing that the kind of estrangement mediated through the photograph was what had these youngsters move more freely. I'm basing this idea on a thought of Georg Simmel when he writes in his essay on the stranger from 1908 that the stranger, like the poor and like sundry inner enemies, is an element of the group itself. Distance, to Simmel, mediates fairness and nearness and levels the experiences of people moving in a shared space, including also those who are officially excluded. This feeling at home in acting out the role of the stranger seems to have played a role in the travels of a number of youngsters at the time, maybe in particular in the instances of tramp and hitchhiking. If we look at Abraham Zeev here, for example, we are somewhat baffled by the ease with which he seems to hitchhike, even approaching drivers at a local gas station, and also at the relative nonchalance with which the event is being documented by the friends. At the same time, this encounter also allows for the suggestion that the protective status of the stranger worked the other way around and was what in fact enabled the system of tramp to function. In a 1938 essay titled Jewish Youth Between Yesterday and Today, and Tomorrow, the Zionist Günther Friedländer bemoaned the new Raumlosigkeit, absence of space that he observed in Jewish youth in Germany. The home, he writes, has become a place in which the sorrows of daily life became apparent and which was shaped by nervous tensions and restlessness. Youth movements, which had sought to provide a home for teenagers in the early years of the decade, lost their attraction, and no new space was available that could replace it for them. As a result, this youth lacked a home, a homeland, and a perspective, and risked drifting into personal and moral dereliction. With my paper, I have tried to show that, in a way, the same kind of drifting that was often dreaded by older peers and adult educators was in fact an integral part of the socialization these youngsters received and gladly built upon, and that it was what prepared them for a life of independent choices, rendering them more flexible, detached, and mobile. The movements praised by Friedlander then did both more and less of what he claims they did. They prepared these youngsters for a life under political constraint. They could not provide a space for them to practice the kind of independence they craved and would need. Photography not only helps us to trace these roots, it also reflects the ways these youngsters saw themselves in the environment they traveled. It served as an extension of their agency in that it offered ways to pierce the environment even more thoroughly. Positioned between the photographer and the motif, the camera mediated attachment and distance. I want to end my talk with a map that seems to tell the exact opposite of the first picture shared today, and that's here in the background. This is the youngster Werner Tom Angres leaning over a map of Holland in excitement over a planned trip in the summer of 1938. But maybe this is just ostensibly opposed to what we saw in the beginning. While adults prepared for their departure by contemplating maps of other places, these youngsters prepared for a life of utmost mobility by never actually allowing for the stasis of the home. All focused on possible routes, Angres is both anchored in the present and is accustomed to the fact that this present means, in fact, movement and travel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebekka, for this fascinating presentation. And the next paper is going to pick up very much where Rebekka just ended, i.e. the transition from mobility to actual emigration. Now we're going to hear from Shira about last pictures.
Okay. Hello, so thank you very much, Mike, and also thank you for agreeing to moderate and respond to our papers. And I would like to join Rebekka by thanking the organizers of the conference Sarah Wobick-Segev that actually made us all gather together from 3 different continents for this panel, for being part of this fascinating project together with Rebekka, Sarah, and Ofer Ashkenazi from the Hebrew University. In 1927, more than 2 decades after Marcel Proust led his narrator of In Search of Lost Time to grasp the memory of his grandmother by means of photographic metaphor, and over 50 years before Roland Barthes will ponder upon his own grandmother in his reflections on photography in Camera Lucida, Siegfried Kracauer conjured his own grandmother in his essay Die Photographie. In this Weimar essay, Kracauer reflects on a juxtaposition of a photo of his grandmother taken 60 years earlier with a photo of a generic film diva that had been recently printed in a similarly generic illustrated magazine. In both pictures, both women are 24 years old, only that the writer knows that one of them happened to be his grampy and by now dead grandmother, whereas the other is very much indeed a 24 years old cinema star. Perplexed in the face of this peculiar proximity between the film diva and the late grandmother, Kracauer wonders, quote, is this what grandmother looked like? Slowly but surely, Kracauer substantiates the essential difference between grandmother and the young lady with the crinoline in the photo taken 60 years ago, and declares finding the true grandmother in the memory image, Gedächtnisbild, left of her, rather than in the remaining photographic representation. A true memory image of a person, Kracauer contends from that, is necessarily the last image of this person, one which contains no less than, quote, the person's actual history. According to Kracauer, such a last image won't only subsume a concentrate of memories from the respective person, but will distill them into a configuration of non-arbitrary elements, which will allow to access the promised actual history. Against the backdrop of Kracauer's dichotomy between the photo and the last memory image, I would like to approach in this paper a series of what would be defined as last photos, in distinction from Kracauer's mental last images. Photos which were produced, narrated, kept, and preserved by Jews in Nazi Germany and their offspring. These photos and their respective framings, so I will argue, showcase a spectrum of interplays between memory and photography, thus invading Kracauer's term of the last image as pertaining to photography in general and to concrete case studies which are to be discussed in particular. But first thing first, what is a last photo? I would like to suggest a wide definition of this category, bringing together different aspects of what Elizabeth Edwards and Janice Hart have recently defined as the 3-dimensionality of the photo as an image and as a physical material object. A last photo could therefore be a last photo taken of or by a person, the last photo to be included in an album, the last photo kept from a person, even if many others were to be taken later, a last photo of a place taken before departure, and so on and so on. It could be defined as a last photo in the moment of production, in hindsight, or not at all. It could be framed as last through its intexicality by dint of accompanying captions in a testimony of a family member who inherited it or in a note added by an archivist. Consequently, the memorial baggage encapsulated in and ascribed to such a photo is manifold, and so is its relation to Kracauer's term of the last memory image. Furthermore, this suggested category of the last photo challenges the separation between first-hand memory and post-memory, a term coined in the early 1990s by Marianne Hirsch, which encapsulates the relation of later generations to the inherited memories and collective past experience. Similarly, it expands the term after image, originally coined in 2000 by James E. Young in order to define artworks dealing with the memory of the Holocaust by artists that were born to the second and third generations. Young's term proliferated in particular in the German scholarship, where it was translated into Nachbilder and employed in order to signify imaginary representations on the basis of visual vestiges. In the original and by now commonplace definitions, the different temporal prefixes of Hirsch's and Young's term, post, after, or the German nach, all infer a physical, mental, and generational distance from the actual image, photo, or memory. As will be shown, this temporal and a time-spatial gap could be oftentimes traced back to the photos themselves. In the context of Jewish photography under Nazism, taken and preserved in a period of incessant vicissitudes and peril, this duality reveals such last photos as multi-layered objects which contain testimonies of an ur-image, to use another term of Krakauer, while framing them as after-images, sometimes at the very same moment. The last two images in Felix Axelrad's photo diary, entitled, let me see if I can actually move between the slide. Yes, I can. Entitled Oyanburg 1930 to 1933, showcase such a superimposition of an ur-image, after-image, and a memory image underlined by a verbal narration. Axelrad, born 1903 in Belgrade, was based in Vienna until 1940, when he fled with his family to New York shortly after the war broke out. His photo diary contains photos he took during the years he spent working at the manufactory in Oyanburg in the vicinity of Berlin, documenting mainly his travels in the area and the family visits during his years away from Vienna. Axelrad's captions in German are written predominantly in the present tense and seem to have been added in real time. This initial impression is refuted in several occasions in which he turns to write in past tense as he reflects on political events in conjunction with specific images. Such a digression culminates in the last page of the album, where, after a couple of images from last visits and final strolls before his departure to Vienna, Axelrad concludes with two pictures showing clusters of thunderclouds as they cover last rays of sunlight. We can see here at the bottom of the page. The supplementary pages containing descriptions of the pictures by Axelrad conclude with the sentence, "Black thunderclouds have gathered over the German landscape." The last photos are thus charged with a symbolic meaning, which fixes their position at the end of the album, the narrative, and a historical period. The German ur-image and its romantic traits reverberate in the after-image and attest to the position of the narrator and photographer at the eye of the storm and his retrospective interpretation at once. Thus, this last photo in Axelrad's album suggests itself as the actual history of the German landscape as perceived by a Jew in Nazi Germany. A different genre of last photos is found in the abundance of last images taken shortly before emigration from Germany by those who emigrated, or rather by the ones who remained behind. These pictures form a different category from the ones documented and accompanied the event of emigration itself and the preparations which preceded it. Photos which, as shown by Maiken Umbach and Scott Zulzner, did not necessarily document an end of a narrative and were oftentimes used to prove a sense of continuity in spite of crisis. In contrast to this kind of pictures of the immigration itself, of the event of immigration itself, the images taken at the moment of parting and farewell from people and places were often actively defined as last images in a multiplicity of performative ways, both material and verbal. An example is the photo of Ruth Kolschan at the day of her, of her immigration from Breslau, Germany. Kolschan's parents, who immigrated to Sweden in 1934 and returned to Breslau in the late 1930s after having experienced difficulties to adjust, are posing in front of the camera, standing on both sides of their departing daughter, who is situated in the middle of the frame. The back of the photo reads, "In memory of Ruth's departure from Germany, June 27, 1927. In what appears to be a dedication and a description at the same time. This deliberate framing of the picture as a mnemonic artifact is far from being rare in these kind of photos, which became increasingly common in the late 1930s. It reveals the role of photography attained both in the clear-cut moment of production, capturing and turning itself into the event of the moment of farewell, as well as in its subsequent material existence, being either given as a gift or kept as a souvenir. An enhanced association of an active employment of the materiality of the photo, and in this case of the photo album, is evident in the farewell album Henny Jaffe received from her friends shortly before her immigration. The pocket-sized album carries a dedication on the inner side of its cover, reading "Goodbye from your friends, Zela, Inge, Margot, Eva." On its first page, on the right hand of the dedication, a picture of the four friends, without Jaffe, is attached, indicated the year 1938. The same year is indicated again on the photographer's studio stamp on the cover, which reifies the material production of the photo and serves as a reminder of the place where the farewell present was purchased. The verbal dedication, combined with pictures of the four friends, turns here into a symbolic act through which the friends allow Jaffe to physically carry with her a last memory image, which is, at the same time, a last photo of the four girls posing together for the last time for their departing friend. The fact that this last photo opens an empty album waiting to be filled with pictures from the new life in the new destination marks the liminal moment of departure and incarnates it into the materiality of the photographic object. A different framing and gifting of memory through photography on the cusp of a forced immigration is evident in a farewell album dedicated in 1938 to Gerda van der Poort by her parents shortly before they left the family abode at Mittelweg 118, Hamburg. The album comprises a dedication followed by 7 large photos of the house interior, each of which occupies an entire page, thereby enhancing the physical presence of the photos and the presentational quality of the album as a whole. The pages are covered with wax paper, simulating door opening into each of the rooms as they are turned over. The dedication addressed to "My dear Gerda" define the focus of the images as taken and given in memory of your parents' birth house in Hamburg, Mittelweg 118. The indicated date, May 1938, signifies the moment of departure, but more than anything else, it signified the moment in which the actual home turns into a memory encapsulated in the materiality of the images and the album, both of which, from now on, function as a portable lieu de mémoire. Krakau's denial of the mnemonic function of the photo is overturned here through the agency of the dedicating parents. The photographers appear to be a professional one, the parents attempt to create a last memory image of the home through the last photos documenting it. A separate group of last photos are the ones defined in hindsight as such, at times by family members who were not present at the moment when the photo was taken or were not even born yet. These kind of pictures and the frequent retrospective framing as last photos call special attention to the share of post-memory in the production of meaning in images documenting past generations. In contrast to some of the well-curated last photos, which were so far discussed, these photos often demonstrate more of what Krakauer defined as the arbitrary traits of photography, which prevent photos from serving as memory images. An analysis of these images should therefore be attuned to the inherent paradox between their title as last photos, derived by an attempt to perceive them as a last memory image, and the frequent mundane, non-representative nature. 2 examples of this group of photos from our collection include the last photos of Carolina Lurbel from Bamberg, taken a year before her deportation to Minsk through Theresienstadt, and the last photo of Margaret Frankel-Kuttner from Berlin, taken just a couple of days before deportation to Auschwitz. Lurbel was the last from her family to remain in Germany after 1939. The image was taken on the occasion of her 80th birthday, which was celebrated at a Judenhaus in Bamberg, and was sent to her son in Ecuador some months before her deportation. This picture, presumably the only one left from Lurbel from this time period, was later used by her son, Bernard Loval, in order to conclude a memoir chapter titled "Our Grandmother's Last Message from Bamberg." The photo comes after long quotes from Lurbel's last 2 letters, both of which were written roughly a year after the picture was taken in response to wishes for her 81st birthday. Though the image is far from being a professional one, featuring a disproportionate composition and poor uneven lighting, Lurbel's direct look at the camera supports the implicit attempt to see not only in the letters, but also in this last photo, a last message, and furthermore, a memory image of the grandmother in a natural habitat, surrounded by flowers and domestic decoration. Kuttner's case seemed to be a different one, as it attests to the incongruity between Krakauer's term of the mental image and the photo. Kuttner is not pictured alone, neither does she look straight to the camera. The abundance of furniture and decoration, and especially the disproportionately gigantic standing lamp, thus create the opposite effect than in Lover's image. It does not merge into a characteristic of the photographed subject, but rather deflect the attention away from it. In his memoir and End the Struggle, Paul Kuttner, Margaret's son, described the picture with the following words. The last picture taken of my mother in Berlin, Uhlenstraße 114-15, shortly before deportation to Auschwitz. My sister Annemarie, seen on the left, fortunately went underground a day or two after that and succeeded in saving her own life. In contrast to Loval's title, Our Grandmother's Last Message from Bamberg, and to the various dedications of last images discussed earlier, this descriptive caption focuses on the actual moment, highlighting its randomness and its irrepresentability of the figure of the mother. Here, so it seems, we face a last photo, which is not a memory or an after image. My last example for the day displays a rare inversion of an after image turning into a last photo rather than the other way around, thus suggesting an additional perspective on the analytical potential of the category of last photo. Elisabeth Wust and Phyllis Schragenheim, a lesbian German-Jewish mixed couple who first met and then secretly got married during the war, lived together in Berlin until 1944. Astonishing photos kept at the archive of the Jewish Museum in Berlin show excursions of the two in Germany up until 1944. In September of that year, after being reported to the Gestapo, Schragenheim was reported to Theresienstadt and later taken to Bergen-Belsen in a death march, which he did not survive. Among a couple of other photos Wust handed to the archive of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, there is a single montage picture made out of two half photos showing Wust and Schragenheim. Though the montage was dated by the archive to June 1944, it remains unclear whether the date concerns one or two of the picture's halves or rather the date of the assemblage. Seen in the context of the relatively small collection, this montage picture offers itself as an after image of a special kind, an attempt to create a new image out of existing ones and thus an additional memory or rather a post-memory in the very literal sense of the word. The series of last photos examined in my talk underlines the potential included in the medium of photography in historical and cultural research in general, of German Jewry in particular, a potential which has been increasingly explored over the last couple of years and is yet, of course, to be explored. More particularly, the manifold instantiations and configurations of the last photo, drawing upon the photo's materiality, its meaning, its production, narration, and preservation, while placing it between the ur and the after image, suggests new ways to approach old questions concerning the relationship between memory and history, memory and post-memory, agency and narration. Thus, originally departing from Krakauer's dichotomy and considering picture and narrative analysis within their broader historical context, I hope to have offered today a more flexible net of relationships between the memory image and the last photo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shira, for this wonderfully evocative reflection on the category of the last image, and I have some thoughts on it that I'll offer at the end. But first, we're moving on to Sarah's paper, which brings together the themes of tourism and mobility and emigration. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Now, could I? Yeah, one. No, that's not mine. I need. Perfect. Okay, thank you so very much. So I'd like to begin, as everyone else, by thanking the conference organizers so much for putting this conference together. And of course, also to thank Professor Maiken Umbach, not only for serving as the chair, but also inspiring us. Her scholarship has been very useful and important for us in the field of the history of photography. And it's really exciting to have her with us. I'm particularly grateful for her presence today. Because this conference is dedicated to the very notion of all that is new, I want to begin with a brief introduction on the history of photography as a subfield and a short discussion of the methodological challenges that the study of photography raises. Since roughly the turn of the 21st century, a small but growing number of historians have argued that photographs are a legitimate historical source that can and should be analyzed in ways not dissimilar from the ways that we use written sources. And we've seen this already on this panel. And to this end, they have turned, this group of historians, have turned to the vast but essentially unexplored wealth of photographs that have been taken with ever greater frequency over roughly the last 200 years. From family albums to photojournalism to professional art photography and to many genres and subgenres in between. And to help them analyze these sources, historians have turned to the many theoretical, both cultural and artistic writings on photography. In addition to Krakauer, we can think about Benjamin Warburg, Barth, and Sontag, and many more. Yet 20 years later, the field remains relatively small. And as any introduction to the history of photography will remind us, historians have been characteristically reticent to use photographs as anything more than illustrations of what we already find in written sources. And to be sure, if we consider historians' general hesitance to use photography as a source, we must admit that part of this has to do, at least, with the very nature of photography. Time and again, photography has been noted for its indexical quality, for the seeming ability to reflect that which was. And this documentary nature of many, though not all, photographs has been precisely what made photography useful and appealing to begin with. Photos that document, that's not what I wanted to do. That's not the picture. Forgive me. Photos that document reality as it was, for instance, were useful as legal documents for insurance matters, recording evidence of existence of objects at a given time and place, for example. So among German Jews during the National Socialist Era, we can find photos that were explicitly taken for the purposes of documenting belongings before they fled Germany. Nonetheless, this perception that photographs record what was, nothing more and nothing less, is deceiving. For photographs are also forms of representation, and importantly, for the rest of my talk today, forms of self-representation. And this constructivist conceit can also be extended to albums, which perhaps more obviously present acts of narrativization. Yet even when we accept the idea that photography and album compiling are representational acts, we're faced with yet another challenge when exploring private photography, namely its formulaic and conservative nature. The repetition of styles, poses, themes, and even settings lends a sense of continuity across eras of monumental historic change, thereby seemingly undermining photography's ability to say something meaningful or unique about specific times and contexts in which the images were taken. Yet, as Brian Wallace notes, the importance of these so-called ordinary photos lies, quote, precisely in the complex social functions they enact, how they serve as vehicles for subjects and viewers to assert or investigate issues of personal identity, family affiliation, gender identification, class status, national affinity, or even community membership, sometimes in conformity with societal norms, but often pushing firmly against them, end quote. It becomes the historian's task then to uncover the underlying message behind individual photos or series of images in photo albums, even if at first glance they seem repetitive in their apparent uniformity. And for the rest of this short and necessarily impressionistic talk, I hope to make several interrelated points. First, that German Jews during the National Socialist Era were more mobile than we often assume, continuing to travel in Germany and Europe, sometimes as part of their attempt to find new homes and opportunities, sometimes on vacation in search of respite. As a corollary to this observation, we can add that their mobility points to a much greater degree of agency and resourcefulness that is generally described to German Jews during the Nazi era, even in more recent scholarship. Secondly, I would also like to point to how the actual experience of emigration and tourism overlapped. Instead of presenting emigration and exile as only a moment of rupture, visual sources reveal how emigration was cast visually in a manner similar to vacations, thereby helping to maintain the emigrant or exile's continued sense of self. A significant ingredient in early 20th century German Jewish identity was class-based. And roughly 75% of German Jews by the late 19th century had entered the bourgeoisie, and part of being a good bourgeois German by the turn of the 20th century, and certainly into the 1920s, was participating in this expanding leisure culture to which summertime vacations to the mountains or to the sea were almost obligatory.
And while it is well known that Jews were not welcome at all spas, ski resorts, or hotels, there were certainly enough alternatives for German Jews prior to 1933 that openly anti-Semitic resorts could be avoided and seen as more insults and irritations than as a broader threat. And the rise of National Socialists to power in 1933 did not immediately prevent German Jews from going on vacation abroad, but the regime did ensure that it would be difficult and costly. Foreign currency exchange was regulated, and the process of obtaining visas was made complicated, and fees were levied. Nonetheless, for the German Jews who could still afford to travel during the early and mid-1930s, foreign destinations offered well-needed respite from the anti-Semitic atmosphere and increasingly challenging daily life in Nazi Germany. In Italy, a very popular destination, German Jews could relax, travel, recover a sense of normalcy that included outings at cafes, restaurants, historic sites, and spas that were devoid of those threatening signs that declared that Jews were unwanted. Just as these same trips could allow German Jews to reflect on what was often understood to be Europe's friendlier face of fascism. Critically, German Jews did not just travel abroad, but continued to travel in and around National Socialist Germany. Their photographs reveal complicated attempts to confirm and sometimes insist upon their participation and belonging in this local landscape and society. Susan Sontag, already quite some time ago, noted the passion with which tourists take snapshots, arguing that taking photos, quote, help people take possession of space in which they are insecure. Photography thus allowed and allows tourists to place themselves in an unfamiliar landscape and to take ownership of it, or try to. And in the case of German Jews traveling in Germany, photography presented them with an opportunity to attempt to retake possession of places that were increasingly being denied to them. To be sure, some traveled to sites that specifically catered to Jews, especially as hotels and youth hostels closed their doors to them, or they traveled to visit family members. While others would travel to larger cities or hitherto unfrequented places where they could travel more anonymously. For instance, not too long before their emigration in very late 1937, members of the Meyer family from just outside of Bielefeld, including Andreas, who was roughly 15 years old at the time, and the one responsible for leaving behind a sizable family archive in Israel, along with his mother and sister Britta, and possibly another family member, it's not clear, took a trip to the cities of Hamburg and Lübeck and to the small Baltic Sea town of Dahme. It's unclear what motivated the Meyer family to travel to the north when they did, and again, from what we can tell, they traveled in the summer of 1937. I can also add here that by the looks of it, this was their last vacation in Germany. And whether it was a form of goodbye or an occasion to settle family business or simply a well-needed vacation, or some combination of, they took this trip, sure, not too long before they emigrated, certainly after they knew that they were leaving Germany. We do know, however, that someone in the family chose to commemorate the trip by creating a photo album, a common practice at the time among Germans and German Jews, and that the family brought the album with them to Mandate Palestine. And this, in and of itself, is not a trivial fact, because numerous other photos in the family's possession appear to have been ripped out of albums or stored in envelopes and boxes. So this album remained intact, and the others were recompiled and again, left in boxes and envelopes everywhere. So this album and this trip had clear meaning for the family. The album itself, however, is a curious mixture of images. The first photo in it, and here we have, shows members of the Meyer family sitting at the front of the tour bus, and they're the ones who are here highlighted by the circle. The images of Hamburg that follow present a narrative of the city's important sites, suggesting a possible route for the tourists. So we imagine that with this album, that they are sitting down, that they are in the bus, and that we're going to see what they saw. Yet the photos in Hamburg and later in Lübeck, as they are recorded and compiled in this album, are almost exclusively represented through commercial postcards. Only photos taken on the way to the or at the Baltic Sea, identified again by a postcard, were taken by the Meyers and clearly show family members posing on an unnamed ship or resting on an otherwise nondescript beach. So again, you have a lot of postcards at the beginning and then a lot at the end. And there we only have a small number of photos in the middle of the album on the beach or on the boat. There we get to see the family members again. And the inclusion of postcards and photo albums from this time was by no means unique. It was a common practice and allowed album compilers to insert better quality images than what the album compilers had been able to take themselves. And we see this especially in the case of postcard images that show sites that are higher angles or even aerial shots. But typically postcards accompany one's own images in an album. And the Meyer album here is noticeably different. Instead, there is an unusually high number of postcards. Sorry, here they are again on the beach. Juxtaposed with close-up photos taken of the Baltic Sea, represented synectically by the Strandkorb, the overwhelming number seemed to undermine or at least mitigate the family's ability to take possession of the contemporary Germany. At the very least, it seems to strengthen the sense that the Meyers felt insecure as they traveled through Hamburg and Lübeck. Sorry, I'm just trying to find, okay. And again, here we can even see that these photos that they take and that they add, you can still buy them today. Yet in analyzing the postcards more closely and dating several of them, one can note a key strategy at play. Namely, a significant number of the images were taken before 1933 and therefore represent Hamburg and Lübeck before the rise of National Socialism. In using these images in its album, the Meyer family was able to make a claim to possess or be part of German cities and their major sites that had by the time of their trip become geographically uncertain and unfamiliar. Precisely by taking these photos taking these spaces out of their contemporary political and temporal context. The inclusion of such images allowed the album compiler to reassert a sense of belonging to these German cities, but critically to their pre-Nazi versions. And the preponderance of postcards creates a Germany that was probably far less Nazified than the one they actually saw. And to be sure, only 2 of nearly 70 images reveal swastikas. So here on this, these are the 2 images that we have that we can see that there were swastikas presented in this album. The rest, we don't find it. And so the others are noticeably devoid of this ominous symbol. Travel through Hamburg and Lübeck thus assumes not only the quality of a journey through space, but also back in time as well. And the nostalgia that is created in the process allows the album compiler to imagine him or herself in a Germany that had been open to Jews, and in the case of the Meyers, to intermarried families like their own. The mother was not Jewish. Nonetheless, in presenting so many postcards, the album compiler also effectively took the family out of these cities. The postcards suggest that Andreas and his family were simultaneously there and not there. The confirmation of their presence comes through the possession of the postcards, something that we typically associate with tourists and not locals, but not through the act of photographing the places depicted in them, and certainly not through the act of photographing themselves in those same places. German cities like Hamburg appear to become unstable and impossible sites for Jews or even intermarried families to remain. And the album ends very elusively with a card written from a family member in 2004, presenting a copy of one of the photos that we find in the album. And the letter writer assumes that it was taken shortly after the family had made Aliyah, but asks nonetheless whether it had been taken when Andreas was 15 and thus still in Germany. The generic oceanside boardwalk seemed to make both possible for the letter writer. They also appear to collapse visual categories of home and away, travel and emigration or exile. And taken out of context and based on this single image, it's an understandable mistake on the part of the family member. But there is also an elegant, if entirely coincidental, overlap between one image found in the Meyers album and events that would transpire roughly 2 years later, which would be very well photographed. Namely, this postcard of the SS St. Louis, again, which is found in the Meyer album, in this travel album. Now, the sailing of the SS St. Louis in spring 1939, today a symbol of the world's unwillingness to accept German Jewish refugees on the eve of the Second World War, was a widely photographed event. From the many small and large collections at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum alone, we can see that standard albums were sold. So you could buy this album. Just as it appears, they also were selling or making available photos of people as they boarded the ship. And many of the images from the ship's first days point to a clear collapse of the categories of emigration or exile and vacation. One striking example is from an album from the Evelyn Klein-Altman papers at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Evelyn was a child at the time. She was born in 1930, just outside of Vienna, and her mother and stepfather were able to find safe passage on the St. Louis. And by safe passage, I also mean they actually got off at Havana, where they were one of the few people who were as lucky. Now, the album, as shown here, opens with pictures of two buildings, including on the top left, the Hapag luggage station. And the caption, which begins with the words, quote, "We are leaving Europe," explains that several days in Hamburg were necessary in order to attend to various bureaucratic matters, having their documents checked, dropping off their luggage, and even getting immunized. Their brief stop, however, in Hamburg did not preclude sightseeing, though. On the second page, young Evelyn and her mother are now seen as ambivalent tourists, crossing Hamburg and admitting that despite it all, how beautiful and splendid, schön und großartig, Hamburg was. And the two images nonetheless do not show recognizable sites in Hamburg. The first appears to be taken on a relatively busy but otherwise unidentifiable street, and Evelyn, the young girl, is photographed at some distance from other passers-by. The photo to the bottom right shows mother and daughter posing by an impressive building, but again, they are removed from other people. We don't see them next to other people. And while in many ways very different from the images that we see in the Meyer album, not only because of the fact that we have professional photos of major sites, the two sets of images do nonetheless reflect similar motivations, the desire of insecure tourists to be seen and not seen at the same time. In the Klein-Altman photos taken on this page, the daughter, first alone and then again with her mother, are shown in situ on the streets of Hamburg, but they're noticeably away from any prying gaze of a passerby or the possible intrusion, somebody to pass by and ask, "Who are you and what are you doing?" And the photos suggest a certain hesitance of the family members to make themselves noticed, and perhaps even a reluctance to congregate around larger, more well-known sites. And I'm still trying to figure out who or what building that is in the one on the lower right-hand side. And there is a possibility that it's actually just the Finanzamt, so that there is a certain pretending act of being tourists. In this way, the images display the family's unease at still being in Germany, an emotion that is obliquely recalled in the captions. The photos taken on the ship, like a great deal of images taken by other passengers, do not display the anxiety or rupture of exile, even though they do mention motion sickness. But instead, they present the voyage visually as one might a vacation, something that's made all the easier by the fact that the SS St. Louis was a luxury cruise liner that offered dancing, babysitting, swimming pools, high-quality food that was no longer available back in Germany. And the Klein-Altman album shows the family relaxing on the deck in comfortable chairs and enjoying the sun, as well as taking part in a children's ball. And as I stated at the beginning of my talk, the propensity of private photographers to reproduce seemingly stock imagery, including casual snapshots while on ferries around Germany, as we saw in the Meyer album, or on dramatic transatlantic ocean liners, continues to pose challenges to those who seek to use them as meaningful historical sources. Yet the very repetition of imagery points to the photographer's agency and desire to use and maintain a familiar habitus in order to resist the increased exclusion and even dehumanization that these individuals faced during the National Socialist era. The insistence on imagining and representing exile and emigration as a vacation highlight a visual and thus also a psychological strategy. The party atmosphere that is depicted in so many photos from the first days of the SS St. Louis's voyage reflect the very real and palpable relief on leaving Nazi Germany behind them, just as there must have been no small degree of satisfaction by being served by a German non-Jewish crew. Yet photos taken in Germany also point to the Jewish agency. Through them, we see everyday attempts to find and claim normalcy, to resist displacement, and to make claims to the German landscape, or at least to an earlier, different Germany. Photographs also express ambivalence at traveling through Germany, but also ambivalence in leaving it, in a country which by 1937, and certainly by the spring of 1939, had become profoundly hostile and dangerous to German Jews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this wonderful paper. And I'm going to offer a few thoughts and comments, summarizing some of the key points and posing a few questions, but I'll try and keep this brief. I know we don't have much time. So what can photos show us that written sources can't? The three papers we've heard have addressed this in terms of the importance of imaginaries of mobility and travel in the macro-historical context of flight from first life in and then flight from Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Now, when it comes to immigration, this lens of travel was crucial, and it seems to jar at first glance, right, with the seriousness of the political situation. But I think it really draws our attention to the way in which individuals draw on individual meaning-making templates that they've practiced and rehearsed before to make sense of even something as, on a scale of magnitude, as Nazism and the Holocaust. And the lens here, of course, is not just metaphorical, it's also literal, the lens of the camera and the lens of the camera on tour, the camera as a primary technology, if you like, for documenting mobility and travel. And this is true more generally in the 1920s and 1930s, when camera ownership, private camera ownership, really explodes in Germany, and it's way ahead of most other European countries in terms of just how many people have cameras. Travel is the principal occasion for for photography. Travel from the modest weekend outing to the grand international trip and a lot in between. Being elsewhere was an opportunity for Jewish and non-Jewish Germans alike to pose for the camera and to imagine themselves in new roles. So in a sense, what we see in photography, I think, is not so much the history of the everyday. People don't photograph everyday routines or the mundane aspects of everyday life and work. They photograph special occasions, and most often they photograph travel, being away, being on the move. And travel forms almost a symbiosis, I think, with the idea of projecting an identity for the camera, which is less about the here and now, as about an anticipated future, an aspiration, a life hoped for and imagined, rather than a realistic depiction of the life that already is. So all this predated emigration. As Rebekka points out, for German Jews, photographing their own mobility in the 1930s becomes a way to reclaim a space as it's being denied to them. And she sees this trend as being particularly marked amongst youngsters, for whom travel became an important vehicle for coming into their own, imagining and acting out a new adult sense of self, a kind of a dress rehearsal, if you like, for adulthood. And this brings me to one specific question I had. Rebekka, you sort of differentiated this youth travel from the more sort of mainstream travel of older individuals and families, which is part of sort of signaling one's belonging in German culture, or this idea of Bildung, of self-formation, with the obligatory trip to, see the pretty landscapes, see the classical sites of Italy and so on. And yet, in some ways, it seems to me that this youth travel is actually much closer to the original German concept of Bildung, that is not just education, but self-formation. Right? If you think back about the sort of the novel of Bildung, whether it's Goethe's Werther or Novalis, it's all about the young person and a sense of adventure, self-discovery through risk and travel into the unknown, not simply sightseeing and relaxation. Sarah and Rebekka also pointed out that travel photography is about enacting distance. The tourist is an observer, but not herself part of what she observes. And this peculiar ambiguity of travel photography, of being there and not being there at the same time, makes it, both papers suggested, uniquely suited, this genre of photography, uniquely suited to those negotiating racial exclusion within Germany. It allowed them to photograph spaces in which their sense of belonging was precarious. So in the hands of German Jews, then the camera assumed a new significance that it didn't have for other Germans at the time. And this is also true for the last images that Shira discussed. The last image is a photo that commemorates a home or homeland that's being left behind, but the image plays very different roles in that kind of commemorative work, and an ambiguity which Shira captured in the triad of the Ur-image, the after-image, and the memory image. One that particularly jumped out to me was the first example you discussed, Shira, the Axelrod's thunderclouds. This sort of classic example, a metaphor for the gathering storm. So with the benefit of hindsight, right, that becomes a metaphor for the gathering clouds of eliminationist anti-Semitism, and therefore it's the signifier of why the departure. And yet, I think this raises really interesting questions about that relationship between visual evidence and the written or the verbal metaphor, right? The gathering storm is almost a cliche, and it's easy to say, okay, so here the photo just illustrates the sense of the threat that's emerging and threatening to overwhelm the individual. And yet the image differs in two ways from it, I think. On the one hand, it's of course much more personal, right? So the gathering clouds is kind of political phrase, but here it's a beautiful, it's a stunning image of the sun peering through the clouds. It's romantic as well as ominous. It reminds us of Caspar David Friedrich and so on. But this is something where the individual is really there and really seeing it and experiencing it in a very visceral way. So it's more personal than the verbal phrase. At the same time, it's also, it seems to me, oddly more universal. Right? So this is not just about the imminent threat posed by Nazism. It's the kind of foreboding that we get from the picture. It's a kind of existential threat that transcends, it seems to me, the specificity of the political threat in question. A general question then I want to raise is, what is the relationship between these sort of verbal templates, if you like, for meaning making and the visual ones that we see in operation in these albums? And one final question that I wanted to raise, and this really arises from a point that you made, Shira, when you said that the last images can also become the first images in the new album, that the example you showed of the group of friends stuck in the first page of a picture that then becomes an album about the new life started elsewhere. So the image commemorating the farewell to Germany acts as a kind of overture to new life that is being planned and anticipated in a new country. But it's not just a question for Shira, it's a question for all of you, really. And I know the scope of the project that this arises from is within Germany, and it stops geographically at the boundaries of Germany, although we have just seen some pictures on board the St. Louis, so pictures of transit itself. The St. Louis famously didn't reach its destinations for most of its passengers at any rate, but many other ships, of course, did. So I wonder what happens after arrival, whether it's in Palestine for the Myers or whether it's in New York and so many other places. Do you have any sense from the material that you looked at how portable this German Jewish habitus of using the camera to place and not place oneself in space is? Because people don't take their albums with them, they also take the camera with them, right? So they're carrying on with this technology. But is it simply a story of continuity, or do you think the practice of photography radically shifts in meaning once a new destination outside Germany has been reached? So I will stop here and ask you to perhaps give brief responses in any order you want, and then I'm going to ask if there are any further questions from the audience, and while we're listening to your answers, perhaps audience members could start posting anything they would like to hear more about in the chat, please.
So maybe I start actually because my topic, I think, offers itself as a transition into the question, just because the youngsters, and I want to thank you for this question because it's an intriguing one, and of course also for your comments. The question about continuity is especially intriguing because these youngsters are on the one hand very much in Germany, very much in their travels, and documenting them. But then on the other hand, they are also knowing that this is probably some sort of end period, like some sort of Abschied period. Tom Angres, when he's planning his trip through Holland, he has already been part of the Großbresen training farm, which is supposed to train him for migration. So while he's planning his trip through Holland, he also knows that everything he has done in the previous month was for him in order to get ready to leave. And he doesn't know yet where, but then he does leave. It's one of the few non-Zionist training camps, so he doesn't get to Palestine. Abraham Sief, on the other hand, who still tramps through Germany in 1937 and then still takes photographs in early 1939, then gets out to Palestine. And the most impressive the most impressive fact of this transition and of these people knowing what is awaiting them probably, or they have some sense of it, is that some of these albums actually continue. They are not just being concluded with like a last picture in many cases, but they are being continued in new places. And for this, we have quite a lot of albums that actually show that there is no real cut between Germany and Palestine. And like sometimes you even have to ask yourself, wait, was that still taken in Germany, or is this already Palestine? Like sometimes it can get confusing. But so this kind of continuity is certainly there, just also because there were still pages in the album, and then people would just continue them. You can actually see this also from the captions, which then turn into being written in Hebrew a lot of times, sort of to express these youngsters' new rootedness in this new place. On the other hand, you see, and that's where sort of an aspect of cut or rupture still comes in, is that on the other hand, these places are new to them, and so they look at them with a new eye. They look at them with the eye of a newcomer, more curious, more sort of fascinated by everything they see. A lot of times these photographs, for example, include just pictures of a cow or a house, and then it's written underneath, "This is our new house." So I don't know, this is like this is a new gaze that I would think that a lot of times is also sort of actually and consciously assembled in order to remember the arrival in a new space. So this is what I can say for these youngsters about the question of transition, of continuity, of what happened after leaving. What I want to say about your very interesting comment of whether this kind of travel that I've described in the paper is actually sort of closer to the ideal of building, I would ask back, or I would suggest that we really think about what we mean by Bildung. I think in a way this boils down to the question whether Bildung is experiencing and seeing, or whether this kind of building also means just being, like the presentness in a space, sucking everything in. That's such a romantic ideal of rather actually of stasis, almost less mobility, less like ticking off boxes, but resting and remaining in a place and perceiving the environment. So it's a very interesting observation, because of course when we look at this tramp appraisal of like the fields, and it couldn't be more romantic, it couldn't be more like in that way patriotic. But then we have to I would suggest that we would have to compare such photographs with other instances, maybe earlier or maybe in other places, to make sure that we're not conflating these different perceptions into something and generalizing, like looking at what it like, or by saying that what it means to look at a field or to capture a field. So I do think there is a difference between the way they like families or youngsters perceive the space, and then we would have to ask, why do they perceive it as they perceive it? And thank you very much. This is a very inspiring comment, and I will continue think about it. And now I think I will give the floor on to the co-speakers.
Yes.
Well, I actually wanted to jump in if I'm allowed, Shira, because it actually fits in very nicely with the Meyer, because the idea of the travel, the Meyer, the Bildung. So the Meyer family, and this also answers the Meyer family go to Palestine as basically almost everybody else through Italy. But Andreas Meyer, in his own memoirs, complains about how much trouble he had to learn Latin and how it just never went into his brain. And so, their trip to Palestine was, they had a small vacation, some sort of vacation-like stop in Italy on their way out, even though they fled under pretty dramatic circumstances. There's reference to cyanide pills being kept for all of them. And so they have this idea of, well, now the parents are, you're finally going to learn something. We're going through Italy and you're going to see the cultural sites that you need to see. But what's also interesting is those pictures are apparently in the albums from Neharia. In other words, they are the pictures of their time in Italy are interspersed with their original, with the albums that they created for their early years. So it's sort of this continuation of an adventure, a continuation of some sort of moment of development, growth, and a new step. But I think, Maiken, to answer one of your other questions, though, is one of the albums that I looked at, and it's the pictures that I showed of Italy come from another album, and there it's actually very interesting because that is an album created by German Jews who were not coming from Germany, they were coming from Palestine. And this also again goes back to this notion of mobility, that it's the 1930s, and they are coming back from Palestine, meeting another German Jewish couple in Italy, in this sort of third country. And obviously they had the means to be doing this, which is it's not a small amount of money to be going back and forth between Palestine and Italy, but they're doing this as a very important trip. So we see this continuation. So I don't know what they were doing in Palestine, but we see this continuation of coming back to Italy, of the Italian voyage still being really profoundly important for German Jews at the time, or for former German Jews at the time. And so I think there's definitely a lot of indications of the moments of continuity, which of course, as I said in my talk, does pose challenges. Where is the photo taken? Where is it going? And but it's clearly part of the arsenal that they have. To sort of make sense of the world that they're in.
Yes, thank you. Shira, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so just very quickly, because maybe we have some questions from the audience. Obviously, my talk went less about continuation and more about the watershed moment. And it is basically, if I want to go to the broader context of our project, it is something we actually started from, asking whether we can distill such watershed moments from the collections, in the pictures themselves, or whether we should refrain from expecting such moments or very clear cuts in the photography, which is, I think, a challenge embedded in the medium of photography more generally. Yes, the idea that a photo cuts and grasps something and makes it into an event, and we have different definitions of what an event of photography is, but this is definitely something we had to struggle with, and we still struggle with. And what I tried to do through this category of last photo is to show how different strategies of narration and dedication, different performative acts are involved in this formation of a last photo, or if we want to take it to Krakauer's idea of last image. And this is what I think makes the verbal element very crucial here. So it's not only because it's going to my comfort zone of words and literary associations. It's really, I think, something which is inseparable from these photos. I mean, these photos were given, were handed, were thought to be a present, were defined as souvenirs. So I think in all of the photos, we can say that the captions describe, but here we really have a kind of performative act of saying, this photo is the memory of. This is the moment where the photo turns to be a substitute for the home of the family, for the friend. And I would just add a last anecdote. So it's funny that this photo album of Henny Jaffe, the friends put this picture from 1938 as the first image, and this is the only album she took with her from Germany. I actually interviewed her husband, who is today, I think, 100 years old. It was 2 years ago, and back then it was 98. In Queens, this is the only album that they have of Henny from Germany. She didn't post any new pictures after that. She only posted some old pictures of her and her friends from earlier years. So the album actually go backward, and then after 4 images, it just remains empty. So in a way, she refuses to do that. She refuses to make this continuation. Now, I won't say that about any album, but the idea that this album is kind of gave to new life doesn't take place in the case of Henny Jaffe. So I think, thank you so much for all this insights and inputs. And I think that, like, to go back to the crucial point of verbal versus image, and the idea of how symbol and iconology function in both realms. I think this is, I mean, going back to the overall topic of the conference, methodology, this is a crucial thing that we need to consider when dealing with photography in cultural or historical research.
Yes, thank you. That sounds almost like a concluding flourish, but I just wanted to very briefly reply. I don't see any other questions at the moment, but please, people, do post something if you do have them. Some of this relates to the question of when is the meaning of a photo determined, right? So it seems to me that there's I wouldn't want to use the word intention, but there's something about the taking of the photo, which often involves also people posing for the camera, although in the example of the Axelrad image, it's just a landscape photo. How the photographer, what they choose, how they frame the picture, and so on. And then the photo is imbued with further and different and new meanings as it's placed in an album, made part of a narrative, captioned, etc., etc. And sometimes these things are very close together. Sometimes they are temporally apart. The album making comes later. You just heard an example of the Italy photos from the Mayas appearing after they moved to Monday, Palestine, in the album about that new place. And there's also then, of course, the question of how these albums were used, right? In the families and the narratives, the stories that are told as families go through the albums. And I'm sure they evolve all the time. It's a point that Elizabeth Edwards has made very eloquently about photography in general, right? That there isn't a singular moment of meaning making. They carry on. And yet I still, I was picking up on the cloud image because it seems to me to symbolize a certain dissonance between the very sort of politically clear and specific meaning that placement in the album as the final image, then the storm clouds become a symbol for the gathering storm clouds of National Socialism, vis-a-vis the ambiguity and complexity of the photo itself, which is, so much more personal than simply saying there's a gathering political storm, but also more universal. Right? So it seems to me there's a really interesting tension that images escape the attempt to pin down their meaning through a caption and have a kind of essential and continuing ambiguity, which pulls not in the opposite direction, but in sort of aligned but subtly different directions, which can be both more specifically personal and more generally human and universal than the sort of politics of the caption.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. And I think it captures very well this tension. Maybe, goes back to the question of what is Jewish photography more generally, but I don't think we will solve this question today.
We will not answer that today, and I do realize we're out of time, although I have so many more questions. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for these lovely presentations. I enjoyed them hugely and learned a great deal, and I hope we can continue the chats and other fora.